Hello my guys, welcome to my March wrap up where I'm going to be telling you all my thoughts on the books that I read in March, which also happens to be my best reading month of the year so far. So in March, I participated in Realmathon. I was representing Teen Time, and like I said in my vlog at the time of filming this, I have no idea if we won. And I can't say whether I have contributed a lot to my team because the prompts were extra hard this year, but I did read a lot of books. I read 13 books in total, which is more than I've read in January or February, almost January and February combined actually. And I read about 1,500 pages more than I have in any other month of the year so far. So because we have quite a lot of books to talk about, I'm not going to dawdle on this intro and we're going to dive straight into the stats. So in the month of March, I read a total of 4,788 pages across 13 books, which broke down to an average of 154 pages per day. For the star ratings, we have a mixed bag. I read 3 2-star books, 3 3-stars, 6 4-stars, and 1 5, breaking down to an average of 3.38 stars per book. For the demographics, I read 5 young adult books, which is quite a lot for me these days. I read 1 new adult and 7 adults. For the formats, I listened to 3 audiobooks, read 1 comic, 1 collection of short stories, and 8 standardly formatted novels. For the genres, I read 6 fantasy books, 2 fantasy romance, 2 mystery, which is a little bit odd for me, 1 non-fiction, 1 romance, and 1 thriller. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 12 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024, and 1 of them was a book from the library because I have returned to my library now and it feels pretty great if I'm being honest. So getting straight into those reviews, the first thing that I did in March was filmed episode 2 of Shelve It or Scrap It, which I will link for you guys if you want to catch up on the series. I'll also put the playlist in the description box for you if you've never seen it before. And I am currently in the process of filming episode 3, which should be hitting your subscription feed in the next couple of weeks or so, fingers crossed. But the first book that I read for that is Wild as the Witch by Rachel Griffin. This is an arc that I received a couple of years ago in the height of like my mental health breakdown, and anything that was a responsibility or an obligation kind of just went out the window. So I'm glad that I finally got around to this because I've heard very good things about Rachel Griffin. In general, Rachel Griffin writes witchy stories in a contemporary setting in the Pacific Northwest. So we have like a real world setting, an element of witchcraft, and a really atmospheric location. And this one was definitely no exception. So this one is following a young girl called Iris who is a witch, but she doesn't want anybody to know that she is because she actually witnessed her best friend's boyfriend dying because of magic a couple of years before the start of this story. And because of how she was treated and because of how people who generally accepted her thought about witches after this event, because witchcraft is well known, she no longer wants anybody to know that she has the ability to do magic. After this happened, herself and her mother moved to the Pacific Northwest where they opened an animal sanctuary, and there is a guy who works there who seems to hate witches. So after a particularly hurtful comment, Iris accidentally curses him because she has this ritual that she does that was taught to her by her grandmother where she kind of performs a curse, but she attaches it to something inanimate so that the curse doesn't actually come into fruition. It's almost like venting, essentially. One day she's cursing Pike because of his hurtful comments, and the curse accidentally attaches itself to an owl. So herself and Pike then have to go out into the wilderness to try and bring this owl back into the wildlife reserve. And the reason that she gives Pike that they're doing this is because it is a particularly endangered species and needs to be protected, and it wasn't strong enough to fly out into the wild by itself at that point. I gave this one, I think, 4 stars. I did really enjoy it. I think that if I'd have read this maybe 10 years ago, I would have definitely given it a 5 stars because it does 100% have a strong romantic element to it. And I did really like the way that that developed between our 2 characters. It is quite an insulated story. It takes place in quite an isolated setting. They are out in the woods, but the only real plot of this book, it is quite short, is that they are going out to find this owl. So it takes place over a very short space of time. I really liked the setting of the Pacific Northwest. I do in every book that I kind of read that's set there, and I really felt that that lent a lot of atmosphere to the story. The character was in a very YA sense, so it's not necessarily criticism, just an observation, but the character was kind of very introspective and allowing all of these like worries and fears to weigh her down, which could get a little bit tedious in parts. But overall, I did really enjoy this one. I enjoyed the atmosphere, I enjoyed the romance, and I will definitely read from Rachel Griffin again. The next book that I read was one that started out very strongly, but I don't feel like it followed through in the second second half, and that one was Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. So I went into this one instantly loving the writing style, but I just felt like it kind of lost its way somewhere around the middle. This one is a YA fantasy that was very hyped way back when it was released. Was it 2018? Maybe? Yeah. It's following 3 characters. Our main one is Zele, and she lives in a world, or they all live in a world where magic no longer exists. The king killed all of the magic wielders in this world, including our main character Zele's mother, but he let the children live. So in this world, there are people who have the ability to do magic, and they suffer a lot of prejudice. They can be easily identified by their white hair, and Zele is one of these individuals. So they have the potential to do magic in theory, but the thing that allows them to perform magic has been eradicated by the king. One of our other main characters is Amari, and she is the daughter of the king, and one day after her father murders her closest friend and like her handmaid, Amari steals an artifact that has been reported to be bringing magic back into the world, and she runs away with it. While she's on the run, she meets up with Zele, who comes into contact with this artifact and regains her magic, and then those two go on the run to escape the king and the king's son, who has been tasked with hunting them down to get this artifact back, so magic doesn't come back into the world. Now, like I said, I really love the writing style in this. It kind of made me realize once again that I can tell from very early on if I'm going to love a book, especially a fantasy, based on how it's written. And I loved Tomi Adeyemi's writing style in this one. It started off with what seemed to be, or what is, like a decently well thought out and reasonably complex plot with a good, like a strong cast of characters that each had their like specific roles and stood apart from each other, and set in also a world that was very well thought out in a way that kind of, it was developed enough for it to be believable. However, when we got into the second half of this, I felt like the characters kind of fell flat. I didn't feel like they were necessarily progressing in a way that I wanted them to, and then it also kind of got a little bit boring, probably in like the last third. So I am really sad about it, because I went into this like thinking it could potentially be a new 5-star, but when I got to the end, I eventually ended up giving this book a 3, because I feel like while it had a very strong start, it just did not continue in that same vein, which was obviously especially disappointing because I had such good thoughts when I started it that didn't kind of come into fruition in the end. I was debating during Shelve It or Scrap It whether I was going to keep this and kind of see how people react to book 3 when that's released and maybe continue on with the series. But if I'm being honest, before I started filming this video, I had to sit for 10 minutes and try and remember what this book was about. It was one of the first books that I read in the month, but I can remember a lot more about Wild as the Witch than I can about this one. So ultimately, I think I made the right decision to unhaul this book and DNF the series. I also finally read The Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson. This one is the 3rd book in Mistborn Era 2, which is my least favorite series in the Cosmere. We all know this. So the 2nd era of Mistborn takes place, I think it's like between 150 and 300 years after the end of book 3 in the Mistborn series, like the conclusion of the first arc. And in this one, we are following 2 characters, Wax and Wayne. Wax is the son of a noble house, but he isn't expected to inherit the house and become the head of the household. So he goes out into the roughs, which is essentially the Wild West, and becomes a lawmaker. He's obviously very surprised when it turns out that he is going to be the head of his household. So he returns to the city, and then he very much struggles to let go of this lawmaker role that he has had for quite some time and like return to the nobility. So when a series of burglaries are reported, and it turns out that very influential people and people of the nobility are being kidnapped during these robberies, Wax can't help but to involve himself in this case and start to investigate. And then he takes along his old sidekick from the roughs, Wayne, to investigate this mystery with him. Now, this is a very masculine series to me. We do have prominent female characters in here, but while I don't necessarily have an issue with how Brandon Sanderson writes women, like in his other series, like I don't like Shallon and the Stormlight Archives, but I love the other 2 female characters. I love Vin. I love the characters in Warbreaker, but in here, it feels to me very much like Brandon Sanderson is mansplaining feminism. Like, we have a character who is not your strong female warrior. She is more reserved, she's more quiet, she thinks very little of herself, if I'm being honest, and she has more of a quiet sort of strength than being like out there with a sword like fighting the bad guys, and that is fine. Like, we know that women like that exist in the world, we know that women like that exist in literature, but the way Brandon Sanderson portrays her is to like really like double down, and from her perspective kind of like make sure that the reader knows that she is a strong female as well, just not in the way that like Vin is, for example. So while we do have female characters in here, it really grates on me the way that like especially Steris is portrayed. I hate Wayne. I think Wayne is a massive creep and he gives me the major ick. So I hate the fact that he's such a prominent part of this and like one of the heroes of this story. I will say that I do really like the developments that are happening regarding the Cosmere as a whole in this one, which is essentially the reason why I'm still reading this series. It is incredibly integral to tie in the Cosmere together, so I do have to suffer through it. I could go on Coppermind and read synopses and like get the valuable information that I need, but I think for me and what I want from the Cosmere as a whole, it's important to me that I read it physically. So I am glad that this one is finally over, finally out of the way. I do know that there is a 4th book in Second Era Mistborn, but that only has to be read after Rhythm of War. So in my Cosmere journey, I'm currently going back to rereading the Stormlight Archive, which I'm going to be starting very soon and I'm very excited about. I do know as well that there is a novella that I need to read in between this and Way of Kings, but I'm already on it, guys, don't worry. Oh, and this one I gave 2 stars to. I was not a big fan, but thank you very much to G for gifting this one to me. And then the final book that I read for Shelve It or Scrap It was Ace of Spades by Farida Abike Ayamide. This one is a YA thriller that I'd only kind of heard really good things about, and it is following the only 2 black kids at a private academy. One of them is the head girl and like the senior prefect, and she has like been the most popular person in this school the entire time that she's been there. And one is a guy who comes from a less affluent family than her, and he has faded into the background a lot, but on the first day of school, and I think it's their senior year, he is promoted to either prefect or head boy, and he's very surprised by this because he's very much just like an average student in this school. He really loves music, but aside from that, like, he doesn't excel in any particular way, in a way which would make him be taken notice of in his senior year. So very early on in this book, all of the student bodies start to receive anonymous text messages from somebody who signs off as aces, revealing the secrets of these 2 black students. This is about these 2 who, aside from being black, have nothing in common, have never really spoken to each other, banding together to try and get to the bottom of who is anonymously harassing them. So this gets more and more sinister the more it goes on. I didn't love the first half as much, but I really liked how it steadily progressed throughout the novel until we got to the end point. I did go the audiobook route for this on recommendation from my patrons, and I would recommend, if you are wanting to listen to this or read this book, then to go the audio, because it has like a dual narration and I feel like it really helps to build the atmosphere. Aside from the fact that we have this sinister plot throughout the book, for the most part, especially in the first half, it read kind of like a YA contemporary dealing with like hard-hitting contemporary issues, which is definitely part of what this book is trying to tackle, because I think it's pretty clear from the synopsis that race is a big reason why these 2 characters are being targeted over everybody else. I did really start to enjoy it more when we got to that sinister turn in the middle, but then I do think that by the time we got to the end of this, it's not necessarily that the story went too far, it's that I felt like there was no gradual progression within some of the side characters that we were following to kind of build up to this point. Like, everything seemed kind of sudden and like flipped on a coin, instead of us feeling anything kind of ominous throughout the beginning of this. I mean, some of the characters were massive walking red flags, others flew a little bit more under the radar in my opinion. So I definitely enjoyed my listening experience of this. I did listen to this when I was painting the bedroom, and I don't think I would have had as good a time with this if I wasn't doing something else while I was listening to it, because I felt like in terms of the storytelling style, it was quite simple, which is fine, but it wouldn't have held my attention unless I also was working on a project at the same time, if that makes sense. So I gave this one 3 stars. I had a good time listening to it, but I feel like I didn't enjoy it as much as I maybe expected to based on how much other people love this book. And this one was a gift from Caitlin, so thank you very much to Caitlin for gifting this one to me. You will notice that I listen to quite a few audiobooks, especially at this point in the month, because all of these, this is the next book that I'm going to be talking about, were audio, and that is because I was painting my bedroom. So I had a lot of listening time on my hands over the weekend. But the next book that I listened to was The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. I have gotten into nonfiction recently, as you guys know. So at the minute, with me listening to a little bit more audio, I have been choosing to listen to the nonfiction books that I already have. This one is one that I received from Book of the Month back in the day when, like, if you worked with them, if you partnered with them, they would send you all of the books. So I thought that while I would have it, I would give it a listen, but I I didn't necessarily expect to enjoy this one as much as I did. So this one is a collection of essays by John Green, who we know of course is the author of like The Fault in Our Stars and Turtles All the Way Down, both books that I've really enjoyed. But I have to say, like, I have grown out of John Green and that brand of like YA contemporary in recent years, obviously. Like, I feel like that's pretty apparent. So I didn't really know what to expect from this, but I honestly really like John Green's mind. John Green is one of like the main authors that kind of invented the manic pixie dream girl trope, and he writes in a very convoluted, metaphorical, like existential teenage melodrama kind of way that I know annoys a lot of people and that I really love. And honestly, that is just John Green's voice from reading this. I got a little bit of an insight into his mind and I really liked it. I like how his brain works. So this one is about the human experience. It's almost an existential crisis in a book. It's about how as humans we have the power to destroy the world, but we don't have the power to fix it. We're increasing greenhouse gases and we don't have the power to reduce them. So we can accomplish so much and so little at the same time. And this is little anecdotes tied into like his own life, tied into humanity and existence. And it's kind of like a collection of shower thoughts. So you know, like when you're in the shower and you start to have like these deep meandering thoughts, it's almost like those written into essays wrapped up with little experiences from his life and how it relates to his life, and how as a species humans are both awe-inspiring and also like absolutely horrific. I think something that I really took away from this book as well is that John Green has a lot of anxiety, and that's like a well-known fact, and it really does come through in this book. Overall, like, I really love this one. I gave it 4 stars. I thought that it was fascinating to listen to, and I would definitely pick up more non-fiction from John Green again, and this one I gave a 4-star rating too. My next 2-star was my book club book for the month, and that is Sharpens by Jo Abercrombie. This one is a collection of short stories, which is the reason why I didn't like it. If y'all remember my TBR, you will know that I said I wasn't expecting to love this one because I don't love short stories, and that definitely held true. I think for me, I struggle with things that kind of are a vibe but don't have a point. So like, this is why I don't like things that are fun, because I'm like, is the only point to have fun? And if that is the only point, then I'm not interested. This one spans the entirety of the series so far. So the First Law Universe is a grimdark series. It is 3, 7, 10 books in total, with 2 trilogies, 3 standalones, and a collection of short stories. So this one is read before the second trilogy, and it spans a period of time from before the start of the first trilogy up until kind of around the part that we're at during the last standalone. I think that Jo Abercrombie could have been clearer about when these stories take place, because they just have like the number of the year, and that means nothing to me. Like, I need to know what books it takes place during, after, like in between. That is the information I need from this, and because of that I did struggle to place a lot of these. So some of these have more points than others. There is a recurring set of stories throughout here, which is 2 people who are traveling together and always getting into altercations. I kind of figured that set of stories was included to provide some continuity throughout the collection, but it wasn't my favorite because it wasn't particularly tied to anything. We had some stories following characters that we know and love from the series. Some of them, like I said, were just kind of a vibe, like a glimpse into this person at a different part of their life, which was nice, but ultimately didn't really have any point. My favorite stories in here though, there are 2 that I liked. The first one was Wrong Place, Wrong Time, and that was a look at like the collateral damage of some of the books in this series. So it was essentially NPCs in scenes, like big scenes from one of the earlier books. So one of them takes place in a brothel that we see in the first standalone in First Law, and it is one of the women that work at the brothel and kind of her experience of that scene from a different perspective, which I thought was just interesting, and I would have liked more kind of stuff like that. And the other one was the final story in here, I think, which was Made a Monster, and that one was a look at one of my favorite characters from this series, which is Logan, at a point before the first trilogy. Now I do have criticisms of that because Logan does not feel like the same person. Like, I can't even see a thread of him, and he does have an epiphany at some point where he kind of has a very different outlook than he does at this point. But while I loved seeing Logan's backstory, I didn't feel like there was anything. If it didn't have names on the page, like if I didn't know that that was Logan, I wouldn't have assumed that it was him, if that makes sense. So overall, I gave this one 2 stars. As y'all can tell, did not have a great time with it, and I'm really glad that I'm going into the second trilogy in First Law now, because I have not had a good time with any of the standalones or the short story collection, while I did really love the first trilogy. So I'm hoping for a little bit more of like what I loved about the first trilogy in the second trilogy, instead of like what we've been following in these in between parts. And this one was actually a gift from Lamia as well, so thank you very much to Lamia for that. I then finally read Poison Study by Maria V. Snyder, which has been a long time coming. I have had this paperback for a long ass time, and I'm now finally getting to it because I am buddy reading this with one of my friends, Beth. So this one was different than I expected it to be. It is I don't know if it's YA. I don't know whether it's classed as YA or adult. We have a love interest who is in his like early 30s, and we have a main character who's like between the ages of 18 and 20. I feel like the age gap, if it was now, would be highlighted more, but because it's 2006, it's not really the focus of the story, and it isn't really the focus of the story. It doesn't really come into question at any point, but I feel like elements of this series do read like YA, but elements of it do lean into like an older audience. Like content warnings, there's quite a graphic sexual assault scene in this book, so I'm not sure exactly where it falls, but I do feel like even if it is YA, it is the kind of YA that's transferable to an older audience, because I did really enjoy this. But this one is following a girl called Yelena who is going to be executed for the crime of murdering the son of one of the generals, and it is set in a world that used to have royalty and magic, but the commander killed the royal family and had all of the magicians executed. So now the world has been split into I think 8 equally sized sections, with the commander ruling over one and then a bunch of generals. So Yelena killed the son of the general of the sector that she lived in, and she has been sent to be executed for this crime. Now it's been I think at least a year since she committed the crime, and she's kind of been rotting in the dungeons up until the commander's assassin and advisor Valak pulls her out and offers her the job of being the next food taster for the commander. This is obviously a dangerous job because they're expecting the commander to be assassinated, and there's been a long line of food testers, but Yelena does decide to take this opportunity and chooses to live. This does come with its own kind of consequences though, because the general whose son she killed is not happy that she gets to live, and so he is trying to get the revenge that he feels he deserves on her, even though this new law, this new system that the commander oversees is very strict, and the law states that the next person in line to be executed will become the food tester when that job is available. And so everyone's kind of defending Yelena, but this general still like has a score to settle. This does have a romantic subplot in here. I wouldn't call it a fantasy romance though, because I think that the romance is not the subject of the story at all, even though these two characters do spend a lot of time together throughout the course of this book. The only thing that I didn't like about this is that it has quite a, I want to say like a diary writing style, in that it is very much an account of like this thing happened, like I went to lunch with Valak, and then I went to check in with the commander, and then I went to train with my friends. And any kind of romantic altercation is written in very, like, you don't have a description of like his mouth moved towards mine and I felt butterflies in my stomach as he leaned closer. It literally is, we kissed passionately and then we rejoined the group to talk about the plot. And I thought that that was an odd choice. I'm fine with it being like fade to black, but just with the romance being written like that when a romance has been included in this series. But aside from that, I did really enjoy this story. I find the political, like the current state of the world, very interesting, because I don't necessarily agree with the commander's actions to remove the royal family and kill all of the magicians, but it does seem like the reasons behind doing that and the parts of the current system they have in place seem to be working and much better than what was in place previously. So I was really interested in the world. I liked the love interest. I liked the setting. The setting felt almost like the first book in the Farseer trilogy, just in the setting. So don't get too excited going into this expecting the realm of the Adlings. It isn't that, but it could have been set in Bookkeep Castle. I also really liked some of the side characters in here, especially the two guys that kind of like take Yelena under their wing. And while I know a lot of people love the first book in the series the most, I'm still really excited to get into the rest of this series, especially because I think that book 2 has a magic school setting. And my final rating on this one was 4 stars. I think my final 2-star of the month was Shadowlands by Stacey Marie Brown. We all know that I am done with this series at this point. I'm so happy that it's over. This one is the final book in the Savage Land series. It is a like apocalyptic style fantasy romance following a girl who is the ward of the king, and from her position of privilege she steals drugs from the trains that transport them between the human and fae sides of the city and put those goods onto the black market where the poorer people who need the money can profit from them instead of the profits lining the pockets of the elite. One day when she's doing this, she's caught at the checkpoint between the fae and the human sides of the world and thrown into a maximum security prison where she meets the very powerful, very alluring half-fae warrior Warwick Farkas. This series is incredibly repetitive. It didn't need to be 6 books. I think book 5 is pretty much entirely redundant, and because of that, at this point in the series I haven't been enjoying it. Earlier on I thought that it was super compelling and super addictive, but I just feel like it should have been 3 or 4 books instead of 6, and I would have left this series on a higher note that I'm currently ending it on, because at this point I'm just really tired and glad that it's over. This one was also multi-perspective, which I thought was unnecessary, especially with the amount of perspectives we have. We could have just had 2, but I think we actually have 5 in total. We're following 4 men and the main character, and previously this series has only been from the perspective of Brexley, the main character. But it is also clear from the way that this series ends that Stacey Marie Brown, I don't know whether, because it's indie so anything can happen, I don't know whether she is still intending this, but at the time that this was published she definitely intended to spin off with at least one of the characters, but she left a lot of the male perspectives pretty open-ended, which did kind of annoy me because I'm definitely not continuing, I can say that for sure. But also, like, this introduced all of these male characters as their own perspective and put them in a pairing with a different character, which has been like kind of alluded to in the earlier books, but then didn't resolve any of that so that there's room to spin off instead of kind of wrapping those up a little bit as they are relationships that we have seen in earlier books. It's also kind of annoying because we had so much dead space in this series that this one is like going to spin off and like leave things unresolved for potential further books, when we could have had some more of that reconciled in like book 5, where essentially like nothing important happened at all. So overall I did give this one 2 stars. It is not the worst book in the series. In fact, it's probably one of the stronger books in terms of how much plot it contains, but I just feel like this was a very, like, it was a book that was pantsed, not plotted, and it kind of just like goes wherever it wants on the whim, continuously expanding the world and expanding the plot instead of having like a concise plan for the series and wrapping everything up like a little bit tighter. But this one was a gift from Ash, so thank you very much to Ash for gifting this one to me. I then read one of my most anticipated books of the year, which I did enjoy very much, but not as much as I expected it to, and that one was Faebound by Sarah El-Arifi. This one I buddy read with Aaron. We buddy read all of Sarah El-Arifi's books together, and we both kind of had very similar feelings on this one. So this one is a adult fantasy following 2 sisters who are exiled from the Elven lands. One of them is a commander. She's just been promoted to colonel of her unit, and her sister is a diviner. So on the day that the eldest sister is promoted, she receives a premonition, like a prophecy from her sister, that says that Yerin, the elder sister, will find her glory to the east. So this is kind of like a routine easy day for Yerin, and she goes out onto the battlefield in this kind of never-ending war between 2 of the elven clans, where they're fighting over what is essentially artificial sunlight that is buried in mines beneath the ground. So they are fighting to ultimately gain control of this land, mine the artificial sunlight so they can feed their people. And she goes out onto the battlefield intending to catch a few stragglers after the last battle that her clan won, and she finds nobody there. So she thinks about what her sister Lettel said about seeking glory to the east, and she heads to the east, where she leads her unit into an ambush where there's over 300 casualties. So when she returns home, her chief is essentially like, this is unacceptable. She exiles her from the Elven lands, and one of her captains actually feels partially responsible for the casualties, and so he, along with the younger sister Lettel, head out to find Yerin. Now in the synopsis of this book it does say that they eventually encounter the courts of the Fae, which they definitely do, but I don't want to tell you guys like any kind of manner with which that happens. It happens like 100 or so pages into the book, so it's not that far in, but I just feel like it's better if you experience it yourself. I really enjoyed the world in here, which I expected because I love the final strife and that has a very strong world building. I expected a little bit of a complex, like well thought out plot, which this has to some degree, although my issue with it is that I don't feel like the execution was the best. One of our main characters, Lettle, as I've mentioned, deals with prophecy a lot in this book, and I felt like she literally just delivers prophecies and then kind of washes her hands of them and like moves on, because some of the prophecies that she delivers are so obvious based on the information around her and around the characters in this world, and considering that they are trying to get to the bottom of a mystery, like they're trying to find their way out of a situation and find their way back home, the fact that like they missed these obvious clues when they're actively looking for them kind of really irritated me, and I just felt like the foreshadowing in here was so heavy-handed. There was only one plot twist that I didn't get way before it was revealed, and I'm not used to this from Sarah Elarifi, because in the final strife there are a lot of plot twists and you do kind of start to piece them together before the main characters, but usually just a chapter or so before the main characters start to get it, and it just really bothered me in this book that the foreshadowing and the hints felt so heavy-handed when I know that Sarah Elarifi can do better. And the characters in this world are, the eldest one I think is 34 and the younger one's 28, so I felt like it was extra unbelievable all of these clues were going over their head based on their age and the assumption that they would have like a certain amount of life experience by that age in their life. So that was the main thing that kind of annoyed me about this series, but aside from that, like I really love Sarah Elarifi's writing, love her world building, I love the plot, I really loved the blend of African and European folklore in here and how that came together, and I also really liked the magic system and the different perspectives in different cultures of that magic system, which is kind of all I'm going to say about that. But yeah, overall it was a positive reading experience. I was just really annoyed at like how obvious the plot twists were when I know that Sarah Elarifi like has done better in other series. So I gave this one 4 stars. We'll definitely be continuing, but I do think that the final strife is better than this one. This actually reads a little bit more like a debut than the final strife does, which is interesting because 2 books in that series have been published before this. I don't know whether it was written before, but this isn't the series that got Sarah Elarifi published. But I do feel like if you've enjoyed this, the final strife is like this, but on the next level. My 5-star read was a complete surprise. I did a 24-hour readathon with my patrons in the last weekend of the month, and the prompt that we had for that was short books, so I actually managed to get through a few. But the first book that came up was Die Volume 1 Fantasy Heartbreaker by, it's Kieran Gill and I think Stephanie Hans, but I don't know the name of the last person whose last name is Cowles. But this one is a comic that I've had for a very long time. This is actually an exclusive cover from Traveling Man, which is my local comic book store. I picked it up because of the cover, but then I actually heard really good things about this, especially from G from Book Roast. This one is an adult fantasy series and it is following a cast of 6 characters. Our main character, Dominic, goes over to his friend's house when he's a teenager on his birthday to play a tabletop RPG. It's not D&D, but it is very similar. And when he gets there, he takes his baby sister along with him because she's been having a rough time since the family dog died. He gets there and his friend says that he has actually invented an RPG for Dominic's birthday. So they start to play it, they're all assigned their individual die, and as soon as they do their first roll, they're all sucked into this fantasy world. Now I think 2 years after that, 5 of them return, but they're all a little bit different than when they went, and none of them will speak about what happened to them. 28 years later, Dominic receives a D20 in the post, so he gets the gang back together to get to the bottom of why he's received this, and they once again are sucked into this fantasy world where they have to take up the game again. It's very Jumanji, very Stranger Things, and I liked it a whole lot. This series is actually only 4 volumes and it's already completed, which I like and don't like. I don't like because when I like something I want more of it, but I like it because it indicates a concise plot that it's going to come to an end and not kind of go on endlessly, which, as I'm sure y'all can tell and you all know, I like myself a well thought out, like, tight plot that doesn't have lots of dead space in it, and I feel like that's one of the main reasons why I gave this 5 stars. It has a well constructed plot. You can tell that it's well thought out. The art style is stunning. It has a real ominous atmosphere to it, especially in the portions that are in the real world. And I also really liked the take on the powers that the characters have, because they essentially become the characters that they created in their character sheet before they started the game. So one of them is like a grief knight, and he turns his sadness into power, which is obviously a double-edged sword. It was like a very goth power that he chose, but then he has to be sad to be able to utilize his power. One of the girls is a, what is the name? She wanted to be a cyberpunk, which comes with its consequences after she's been in the game and comes back to the real world. One of the characters is a godbinder, so she is an atheist that keeps gods as pets, which is also super interesting. So I liked everything about it, essentially. This is my first 5-star since January. I have heard that the rest of the volumes aren't quite as good as the first one, but they are also all available on Kindle Unlimited, so I'm gonna get into them regardless, and fingers crossed I enjoy the rest as much as I enjoyed this one. I just kicked my tripod, so it has 100% moved. But the next thing that I read was the last book in a series, which I'm real happy about, because this is another series that I kind of got bored of somewhere in the middle, but I had all the books, so I wanted to finish it out, and that is Queen Takes Rose by Katie Roberts. So this one is the final book in the Wicked Villain series, which is a series of erotic Disney retellings where the villain is the main character and they have a relationship with the like hero or heroine, or sometimes both, of Disney classics. It's a contemporary story, not fantasy, so all of the villains are territory bosses in Carver City, with Hades owning neutral territory in the middle, and the underworld is a sex club, which is Hades' empire. So the final book in this series is following Malone, who is the evil queen, and her relationship with Aurora. I know that this book has had a lot of criticism because it is essentially setting up one of the spin-off series, which is Sabine Valley, and I definitely understand that, but I actually enjoyed it a little bit more for that, because that meant that it actually had plot, which these books typically do not. They are erotica back to front, like, or front to back, I guess, if you're reading it the right way around. But yeah, they have like a very loose plot, but they're not known for their plot. So I actually enjoyed kind of information we got on Sabine Valley. But in terms of the romance itself, like, it was fine. I expected to actually dislike this book, and while I didn't love it, I haven't been reading as much erotica or smut as I used to. I had like a decent time reading it. Like, it's hard, this one, because like I didn't dislike it, but I also like really felt nothing for it at all. I would recommend the earlier books in this series. My favorite were Desperate Measures and The Beast, although The Beast I prefer more to Desperate Measures. You can read them as standalones as well. Like, each continuous book spoils the relationships that come earlier in the series, but I mean, if you know that they're romances and you know that the first one's an Aladdin retelling and it's Jafar and Jasmine, you already know what the outcome's going to be. So if you know your Disney movies, it's not really too much spoilers. But overall, like, it was fine, and honestly I'm just glad that I finished the series at this point. The plot twist that nobody saw coming. One of my favorite books of this month was Pretty Little Liars by Sarah Shepard. I used a spinner wheel to choose my books for the readathon, so this was not my choice, and I actually thought that I was going to hate it. But despite this being a product of its time, it's really enjoyable. It's really entertaining. So if you all don't know what this series is, it's following a group of 4 girls who used to be part of a friendship group of 5. The series takes place 2 years after one of them disappeared, and nobody knows what happened to her, and these girls all kind of grew apart during this 2-year period. However, as they are going into, I don't know what year, their junior year of high school, they all kind of end up being thrown together and finding common ground again when they start to receive anonymous text messages from somebody who is trying to out all of their secrets and signs their messages as A, which is the initial of their friend who went missing, Allison. However, they also find out around the same time that their friend Allison is actually dead when her body is finally found, which is kind of this book. And then the plot of the series is that they band together to try and get to the bottom of who A is. So I expected this to be badly written, boring, cheesy, cringy as hell, and this is actually decently written. It is compelling, even though I know the answers. I know the book series is different, but I know what the Jenna thing is, which is a big mystery in this book. I know why Allison is being so cagey about her boyfriend before she goes missing, and still knowing that and knowing who the relationships are going to be and like what's going to happen, I still had such a good time with this, and I honestly just want to binge the entire series. That's all I want to do with my life right now, and I literally never saw this coming. I'm not sure that I would recommend that you run out and and buy this book to read it, but if you can borrow it from Kindle, I think the first book is on KU, or if you can get it from your library, or if you already own it and are thinking about unhauling it, I would definitely recommend that you give it a try, because I am honestly shook by how much I enjoyed this. Now, obviously it is a product of its time. It was published in 2006 and it contains massive red flags that you wouldn't see in like YA contemporary or like YA mystery series today. One of the main plot lines throughout this series is that one of these girls is having a relationship, like a romanticized romantic relationship with her teacher. Like, it's not a cautionary tale that is full on like we're supposed to root for it. And back in the day, like in 2010 when I was watching the TV show, I was rooting for it. I was a big Ezria stan. One of them is also like constantly going for her sister, like her older sister's boyfriends. So we have relationships between like girls who are 16 and like guys who are like 20. Not necessarily a red flag, but a content warning. There's a lot of like eating disorders and stuff in here. A lot of like bitchy, gossipy, like bullying kind of girl hate themes. But I ate it up. Like, I think that books like this are a time capsule. And I know that there is actually an updated version of this series now where all of the pop culture references have been updated to things that like don't make sense or are not in character, like the bands that the characters would not be listening to based on their personality. While I understand they've done that to appeal to a newer audience, I feel like these are such a product of their time. This is a representation of life in 2006, and I think a new teenage audience going into this, like a 2024 teenager going into this, would rather it be a product of its time than be confused as to why it's supposed to be a representation of modern society, but all of the beliefs and the behavior of these girls is so outdated and such a product of 2006. But that's a little side tangent about the weird updated version. This is the original version and I enjoyed it very much, and I am going to be continuing on with the Pretty Little Liars series in the future, which literally nobody is more shocked about that than me. I give it 4 stars. And then the final book that I read in the month was my Patreon pick for March, which was The Nowhere Child by Christian White. So this one is an adult mystery story about a woman who is living in Australia, and she is approached by a man who tells her that he suspects that she is a child that went missing from Kentucky in the US in the 90s, so like when she was 2 years old. So she first of all does not understand how this could happen because her mother is like one of the sweetest ladies that anybody ever knew, but after looking into it she suspects that this guy might be right, and so she travels to Kentucky to reconnect with her family and kind of see what could have potentially happened to her. We are also following a past timeline in this book that is following the family and the people of this town in the aftermath of this girl going missing. So it deals with a lot of the personal lives and the problems of the people in the town and the family members, as well as this woman going back to that town to try and unravel the mystery of how she could have possibly ended up in Australia. I really enjoyed this one in the way that I enjoy a lot of mystery thrillers, just in that it's like compelling, easy to read. I can actually lose myself in the story. That being said, it's definitely not the best mystery thriller that I ever read. I feel like a lot of the compelling nature of this book, like a lot of my drive to get to the end, was really removed by the fact that I know, or I was like 95% sure throughout the entirety of this book, that this was the girl that went missing. So it was more of a case of how did she get to Australia as opposed to is she actually the girl. And I feel like I had a lot of certainty and not a lot of intrigue regarding a lot of elements of this book. Like when we were reading the perspectives of the people in the past, I was like, I just don't think that this person did this. And so I was never wondering, like it didn't leave me questioning anybody. I was just pretty sure for the most part, for the majority of this book, that everything was to be taken at face value. I gave it 3 stars because I did enjoy it. I definitely enjoyed my experience of this. I thought that it was interesting. It was definitely compelling, but I've definitely read better mystery thrillers. If you are a seasoned mystery or thriller reader, would not recommend this one, but if you want an easy read, it was decent. Content warnings in here for racism and homophobia, including racist and homophobic slurs. And a lot of this plot does also focus on religious fanaticism regarding a like extreme branch of Pentecostal Christianity, which is not necessarily a content warning. Well, maybe it is, it depends, but that does play a big part in this story, which kind of helps to reinforce the homophobia and the racism of the people in this book. My battery is about to die. Can I get through? That was the last book, so can I get through the outro before it dies? Because I do actually want to mention that I did DNF a book in March as well, which was Bone Spindle by Leslie Vedder. This was my Patreon pick for December, and I did start it in February. I wasn't really vibing with it, so I decided to put it down, and then I tried to pick it up again, and I just could not get into it. So I made it about 120, I think, pages into this. It is a YA fantasy agenda bent Sleeping Beauty retelling, following two girls who accidentally stumble across Briar Rose, who is a guy, and have to kind of like decide whether to wake him with true love's kiss. I didn't really get far enough into the book to kind of discover the full extent of the plot and give a good synopsis for it, but I could tell from those first like 100 pages that it was a very fast-paced, kind of like action-packed, fun kind of story, and I just really wasn't gelling with it, and I really wasn't getting into it. So sadly I have decided to just put a full stop on that one, because if I read it, I would just be going through the motions, because I'm not feeling it in any way whatsoever. Not saying it's a bad book, it's just not one that's for me. So those are all of the things that I read in the month of March. As I mentioned, my battery is dying, so I'm gonna make this quick. But down in the comments, let me know what your favorite book of March was, or if you would just like to let me know that you've been here but you don't especially have anything to say, leave me a shushing emoji for Pretty Little Liars, which was the surprise favorite of March that nobody expected. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.